In the spring of 1982, a British soldier stood on a frozen ridgeline above Port Stanley and did something his rifle had been designed never to do. He fired it in anger, in mud, in sleet. At ranges his commanders had been told modern warfare had made obsolete. The L1A1 self-loading rifle performed without a single documented failure attributable to the weapon itself. 6 years later, the British Army retired it. The rifle that replaced it, the SA-80, was subsequently described by the Ministry of Defence's own technical inspectors as operationally unreliable in sand, in cold, and in sustained fire. It would require a complete mechanical redesign, contracted to a German firm, at a cost of tens of millions of pounds before British soldiers could trust it in combat. The L1A1 was not retired because it failed. It was retired because the world it was built for. The Cold War plains of northern Germany, the static weight of NATO doctrine, the 7.62mm cartridge standardized in 1954, no longer existed on paper, but the rifle itself never got that memo. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or ended the world's most important service weapons. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not in England, but in Belgium, in Herstal, in 1946. Dieudonné Saïve was born in Liège in 1888, in the year that the Belgian proof house on the Rue Font des Taux had already been testing arms for 216 years without interruption. Liège was not merely a city, it was a philosophy of manufacture. The Meuse Valley had been producing firearms since the 15th century, and by the time Saïve apprenticed at Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre, FN, in the years before the First World War, the Herstal factory complex outside Liège employed more than 4,000 workers and exported to governments on 5 continents. Saïve trained as a mechanical engineer in an institution that treated the firearm not as an instrument of violence, but as a precision engineering problem. FN's culture was empirical. A mechanism either cycled reliably across 10,000 rounds under adverse conditions, or it did not. There was no aesthetic mercy, no national sentiment, only function. He had spent years studying the work of John Moses Browning, the American designer whose collaboration with FN had produced some of the most mechanically influential automatic weapons of the early 20th century. When Browning died in the FN design studio in Liège in November 1926, Saïve was present. He understood what had been left unfinished. What Saïve recognized, working through the 1930s and the clandestine wartime years when FN's occupied factory produced under German direction, while its design team continued work in secret in Britain, was a gap that no existing military rifle had closed. The gap was this: every major army in the world still carried bolt-action or semi-automatic rifles, designed around cartridges from a pre-war doctrine that assumed long-range aimed fire at known targets. The reality of modern infantry combat, close, fast, continuous, dirty, had rendered those cartridges and those operating systems obsolete. What was needed was a rifle that could fire the new intermediate power cartridge being standardized by NATO, cycle reliably without manual intervention, and be manufactured to tolerances tight enough that a soldier in Norway and a soldier in Greece carried mechanically identical weapons. Saïve filed the foundational patent for what would become the Fusil automatique léger, the lightweight automatic rifle, known universally as the FAL, in 1946. The prototype that reached the British War Office trials in 1950 was chambered for an experimental .280 British cartridge, a round that the British Army's own Ordnance Board had developed in the closing years of the Second World War. It weighed 6.8 pounds empty. It had a gas-operated tilting bolt action, a mechanism in which expanding propellant gas is tapped from the barrel approximately midway along its length, directed rearward against a piston, which drives the bolt carrier back rotates and lifts the rear of the bolt clear of its locking recesses and allows the bolt to travel rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case before the return spring drives it forward, chambering a fresh round. The British trials examiners wrote in their assessment of October 1951 that the FAL represented, in their estimation, the most mechanically mature infantry rifle design they had evaluated since the end of the war. Then the United States Army said no. The American refusal to adopt the .280 British cartridge in 1952 was not primarily a technical decision. It was a political one. The U.S. Army Ordnance Corps had spent considerable institutional capital developing its own cartridge, the T-65, which would become the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, and had no intention of accepting a cartridge designed in Enfield in preference to one designed in Aberdeen. The argument made publicly was that the T-65 offered superior long-range performance. The argument made privately was simpler. The United States Army was not going to arm itself with British ammunition. Britain, dependent on American military and economic support and anxious to maintain NATO cohesion, accepted the 7.62 by 51 mm standard. The .280 cartridge was abandoned. Sive's design was rechambered. The result was the L1A1 self-loading rifle. The designation itself requires explanation. The L prefix denoted a land service weapon. The 1 denoted the first mark. The A1 denoted the first approved alteration from the original design. In British military nomenclature, that string of characters carried the full weight of the approval process through which every weapon had to pass before it entered service. Trials at the School of Infantry at Warminster, endurance testing at the Proof and Experimental Establishment at Pendine in Wales, cold weather evaluation in Canada, and tropical evaluation in what was then British Malaya. The L1A1 differed from the Belgian FN FAL in two significant respects. First, it was dimensioned in imperial measurements, inches rather than the metric dimensions of the original Belgian design. This was not mere traditionalism. It reflected the precision tool infrastructure of British manufacturing, which in 1954 remained primarily organized around imperial gauging, jigs, and inspection equipment. Converting the rifle to metric manufacture would have required retooling factories that did not yet have metric standard machine tools. The practical consequence was that British L1A1 components were not dimensionally interchangeable with Belgian FAL components, even though the mechanical operating principle was identical. Second, the British version was capable only of semi-automatic fire, 1 shot per trigger pull. The FN FAL was available in selective fire configuration, capable of fully automatic fire. The British decision to standardize on semi-automatic only was a deliberate doctrine choice. The War Office determined that automatic fire from a full-power 7.62 mm cartridge was uncontrollable in an infantryman's hands and wasted ammunition without proportionate tactical return. Every shot the L1A1 fired was aimed. That was not a limitation. It was a philosophy. Production of the L1A1 was contracted to 2 facilities. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock in Middlesex, established in 1816 on the River Lea north of London, the institution that had produced the pattern 1853. Enfield rifle musket carried through the Crimea and the Indian Mutiny, and the Lee Enfield magazine rifle that armed 2 world wars, received the primary manufacturing contract. Birmingham Small Arms, the BSA company founded in 1861 in Small Heath, Birmingham, received a parallel contract. Between them, the 2 factories had produced, by conservative estimate, more than 15 million military long arms over the preceding century. The first L1A1 rifles came off the Enfield production line in 1954. The initial government contract covered 100,000 units at a unit cost of approximately £22. roughly 350 pounds in today's terms, at a time when a skilled Enfield machinist earned £8 10 shillings per week. The L1A1 entered British Army service in 1957, replacing the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I. A bolt-action rifle designed in 1895, refined through 2 world wars, and still chambered for the .303 British cartridge that had been standard since the reign of Queen Victoria. That transition, from bolt-action to self-loading, from black powder-derived .303 to NATO-standardized 7.62 by 51, represented the single largest doctrine shift in British infantry weapons since the adoption of the magazine rifle in 1888. It happened in 3 years. The patent that governed the tilting bolt operating mechanism was held by FN. Britain paid a license fee on every unit produced. The arrangement was not celebrated publicly. It was, however, honoured. The L1A1 was issued to the British Army, the Royal Marines, and the Royal Air Force Regiment. It was adopted under local production arrangements by the armies of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and 12 other Commonwealth nations. In Australia, where it was produced by the Lithgow Small Arms factory in New South Wales, it was known simply as the SLR, the self-loading rifle. Australian production eventually reached 220,000 units. The L1A1 was not a moat. It was a family of weapons, and the family was larger than any one factory had anticipated. By 1960, the L1A1 was in the hands of soldiers on 4 continents simultaneously. The British Army's garrison in Malaya had been carrying it since 1958 in the closing years of the emergency. The counter-insurgency campaign against the Malayan National Liberation Army that had begun in 1948 and would formally end in 1960. In the jungle undergrowth of the Cameron Highlands and the Pahang River valleys, at ranges rarely exceeding 100 meters, the L1A1's semi-automatic capability proved more practically useful than the doctrine that had justified its cartridge ever suggested it would be. The Eden garrison carried it through the insurgency in the Radfan Mountains of what is now Yemen, 1964 to 1967. The British units in Borneo during the confrontasi with Indonesia, 1963 to 1966, carried it through terrain that destroyed lesser weapons. The Royal Ulster Constabulary and the British Army of the Rhine carried it through the long decades of the Cold War, one watching for Soviet armor across the North German plain, the other watching for car bombs on the streets of Belfast and Londonderry. By the mid-1960s, total L1A1 production across all Commonwealth manufacturers had exceeded 500,000 units. The Lithgow factory in New South Wales had added a second production shift. Canadian production at the Long Branch factory in Ontario had supplied the Canadian Armed Forces with deliveries beginning in 1958 under the Canadian designation C1. The rifle's effective range of 550 meters, defined as the distance at which a trained rifleman could achieve consistent first-round hits on a NATO Figure 11 target, was unmatched among contemporary service weapons for sustained semi-automatic accuracy. It weighed 9 pounds 13 ounces loaded with a 20-round magazine. It was heavy. Every soldier who carried it knew it was heavy. Most of them also knew they would rather have it than anything else in the Commonwealth Armoury. Music, and then came the Falkland Islands. In April 1982, Argentine forces seized the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, British overseas territories in the South Atlantic, 8,000 miles from the Ministry of Defence offices in Whitehall. The British government dispatched a naval task force. The 3rd Commando Brigade, Royal Marines, and the 5th Infantry Brigade, including the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards and the 1st Battalion Welsh Guards, sailed south. They carried the L1A1. The campaign that followed, from the amphibious landings at San Carlos Water on the 21st of May, 1982, to the Argentine surrender at Port Stanley on the 14th of June, was fought in conditions that no weapons designers in the 1940s or 1950s had specifically planned for: sub-zero temperatures, driving sleet and rain, waterlogged peat bogs, and engagements at ranges from 20 meters to over 500. The L1A1 performed. Consider what that means in concrete terms. If the extractor on a self-loading rifle fails to eject a spent case on a frozen hillside above Goose Green at 2 o'clock in the morning, with Argentine conscripts 30 meters away and no cover, the rifleman holding it has a single-shot weapon and no time to clear it. If the gas piston seizes with mud drawn from the Falklands peat, the rifle becomes a club. Neither of those failures was recorded in the post-campaign weapons assessments filed by the School of Infantry in September 1982. At Longdon, the battle that cost 3 para-18 dead and 47 wounded on the night of 11th June 1982, the L1A1's accuracy at extended range and darkness proved decisive in suppressing Argentine machine gun positions on the rock-strewn ridgeline. Sergeant Ian McKay, who was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions that night, charging a machine gun position to allow his platoon to advance, carried the L1A1 as his personal weapon. No Army-Navy E-award existed in the British system to recognize the rifle itself. The weapons assessments filed in the autumn of 1982 were classified, but their conclusions were not ambiguous. The L1A1 had performed to standard or above standard across every category evaluated. The irony, though no Ministry of Defense document used that word, was this: the Falklands campaign took place in 1982. The decision to replace the L1A1 with the SA-80 had already been made. The replacement program was already funded. The factories were already being retooled. The L1A1 won its last war 6 years before it was retired. The forces that ended the L1A1's service life had nothing to do with the rifle's performance on the ground. They were doctrinal. They were political, and they had been accumulating since the early 1970s. The first structural force was NATO standardization pressure. In 1980, NATO adopted the 5.56 by 45 mm cartridge as its second standard caliber, alongside the existing 7.62 by 51 mm round. The 5.56 mm cartridge was lighter. A soldier could carry twice as much ammunition. The recoil was manageable enough to allow effective automatic fire. The United States Army had been standardized on 5.56 since the adoption of the M16 in 1964. American pressure to bring NATO allies into alignment with U.S. logistical standards was consistent and institutional. Britain, as in 1952, faced the same choice: maintain a national standard or align with Washington. The decision reached in the Ministry of Defense by the mid-1970s was to develop a new generation of British infantry weapons: a rifle, a light support weapon, and a carbine, all chambered for the 5.56 by 45 mm NATO cartridge. The program was designated SA-80. The development contract went to the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. This was the second structural force, the concentration of development, prototype, and production work inside a single government factory that was simultaneously managing the end of L1A1 production, aging machinery, workforce reductions imposed by defense budget contractions throughout the 1970s, and institutional pressure to deliver a program for which the technical foundation, an intermediate cartridge, a bullpup layout placing the magazine behind the trigger group to reduce overall length, was ambitious in ways that the Enfield Design Office had limited prior experience managing. The SA-80, formerly the L85A1, entered service in 1985. Initial field reports from units equipped with it described feeding failures, magazine problems, ejection failures in left-handed filers, and a propensity for the cocking handle to break under field conditions. The Army's own infantry trials concluded that the rifle required further development before it could be considered operationally reliable. The L1A1 continued in parallel service through the late 1980s as the SA-80 program worked through its difficulties. In 1988, the L1A1 was formally withdrawn from British Army service. In 1990, British forces deployed to the Gulf as part of Operation Granby, the UK contribution to the coalition against Iraq. They carried the SA-80. The weapon performed badly in the desert sand of Kuwait and Iraq. Soldiers reportedly requested L1A1s from reserve stock. The Ministry of Defense denied the request. In 2000, the Ministry of Defense contracted Heckler & Koch, the German manufacturer, to redesign the SA-80's operating components, magazine feed system, bolt carrier, and gas regulator. The cost of the program was reported at approximately £92 million. The resulting weapon, the L-85A2, was substantially more reliable. It was, in many of its critical operating components, a different rifle wearing the same exterior. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, the institution that had manufactured British service weapons since 1816, closed in 1988, the same year the L1A1 was retired. 172 years of production on that site. The machines were sold, the patterns were archived, the skilled workforce dispersed. The site was redeveloped. A factory that once produced the standard arm of the British Empire became a housing estate and a retail park. The last rifleman who trained on it retired in 1994. The last institutional memory of its production methods retired with him. The L1A1 did not simply disappear when the British Army retired it. It had been manufactured in sufficient numbers. Estimates of total Commonwealth production across all facilities range from 1 to 2 million units. That its physical presence in the world outlasted its service life by decades. In Britain, deactivated L1A1s and parts kits became immediately significant to the collector market. The Firearms Amendment Act 1988 passed in the immediate aftermath of the Hungerford Massacre and coinciding almost exactly with the L1A1's retirement from service, imposed new restrictions on semi-automatic centre-fire rifles in civilian ownership. The consequence was that working L1A1s could not legally be retained in their original configuration by British civilians. Deactivated examples, however, were legal. The market for correctly deactivated, certificate-bearing L1A1s in original British military configuration, particularly late production Enfield examples with matching component numbers, developed rapidly through the 1990s and remains active today. In Australia, the situation was different and then, suddenly, catastrophic for collectors. Australian civilian ownership of the SLR was possible under licence until April 1996, when the Port Arthur massacre prompted the Howard government's rapid introduction of the National Firearms Agreement. Semi-automatic rifles of all descriptions were included in the mandatory buyback. Approximately 643,000 firearms were surrendered and destroyed. A significant proportion were Lithgow-produced SLRs. Australian collectors who had retained examples to that point, and who wished to comply with the new law, had no choice but to surrender weapons that they and their fathers had carried on active service. The collector market for Commonwealth L1A1 and FAL, variants outside Australia and the United Kingdom. In the United States, where the semi-automatic version of the FAL had been commercially imported as the inch pattern SLR and was legal for civilian ownership, absorbed much of the institutional knowledge and surplus parts that the British and Australian systems could not retain. DSA Arms of Barrington. Illinois has produced American specification FAL variants continuously since the 1990s. Based in part on original FN and Commonwealth tooling patterns. Rock Island Auction Company in Moline, Illinois, the largest firearms auction house in the United States, regularly catalogues original British military specification 1A1s in matching condition. A verified Enfield manufactured example, with matching bolt, carrier, and furniture, in unissued condition with its original military inspection stamps, has brought between $2,000 and $4,000 at auction in recent catalog years. The price is not driven by scarcity alone. It is driven by what the rifle represents to the men who carried it. The museum collections are significant. The Pattern Room Collection, the comprehensive archive of British small arms patterns, prototypes and production examples maintained for decades at RSAF Enfield, was transferred to the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds when the Enfield factory closed. It contains the development sequence of the L1A1 from the earliest EM2 bullpup prototypes of the late 1940s through the trial series of the early 1950s to the final production standard examples. It is, in terms of institutional documentation of a single weapons development, one of the most complete public archives in the world for any 20th century service rifle. The surprise, when it comes, is not military. Dieudonné Saïve, the Belgian engineer who designed the mechanism at the heart of the L1A1, retired from FN in 1963. In his later years, he returned to the Liège Valley of his birth and spent considerable time supporting a small engineering school associated with the Proof House Institution, the same institution whose lineage reached back to 1672. The school was not a weapons institution. It trained precision instrument makers. Saïve believed, and stated in correspondence preserved in the FN Company archive, that the skills that produced a reliable gas-operated rifle and the skills that produced a reliable laboratory theodolite were not different skills. They were the same skill, applied to different problems. The school graduated its first cohort in 1967. It is still operating. What the L1A1's arc actually demonstrates is not primarily a story about weapons. It is a story about how nations inherit engineering capability, sustain it through institutions that seem permanent and prove not to be, and discover its value only after the institutions are gone. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was not merely a production facility. It was a concentration of embodied knowledge of metallurgy, heat treatment, gauge making, tolerance inspection, and assembly procedure that had accumulated in specific hands in a specific place over 172 years. When the factory closed, that knowledge did not transfer to a digital archive. It dispersed with the workforce. Some of it went to private gunsmiths. Some of it went with retired armorers to shooting clubs. Most of it simply ended. Britain did not lose a factory in 1988. It lost the institutional capacity to design, manufacture, and inspect a service rifle from first principles. The SA-80 redesign that followed, contracted to a German firm, delivered at enormous cost, over a decade after the rifle entered service, was the invoice for that loss. In the cabinet of a veteran in West Yorkshire, there is an L1A1, deactivated to current Home Office specification, its breech welded, its gas port plugged, its barrel blanked at the crown. It was made at Enfield in 1962. The date and the manufacturer's mark are still legible on the receiver. The veteran carried it for 11 years. He says it never failed him. The rifle it replaced never quite earned the same sentence. Music. Next week, we follow the history of the company that armed the adversary, the factory in Herstal that Saïve never left, and the story of how Fabrique Nationale became the most consequential arms manufacturer in the modern Western world. See you in the next one.